Right, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second in the two-part webinar series that I decided to put together, explaining the rent before buying process in Portugal. It is literally 4 o'clock in Lisbon, London. So what I will do, if I may, is spend the next minute or so just going through a couple of general comments, housekeeping rules, and so on. And then we will get right into the presentation. As a starting point, just like to say thank you to all those who attended last week. It was a very long session. My presentation was about an hour, and then we had, or maybe just under, and then we had about an hour of Q&A. So just to recap what I said in the first presentation, this is not a presentation about the pros and cons of Portugal, especially part two. This is the buying section of the rent before buying process, and therefore one would imagine by this at this stage that you as attendees and people listening in have already pretty much made the decision that Portugal is the destination for you. So I'm not going to cover anything around Portugal and why it's the greatest place to retire or why it's got more than 300 days of sunshine, any of that. That will not be covered. This is not a product specific presentation either. So it's not an objective here to talk through specific product or the differences between product types in Porto and Lisbon or the Algarve or whatever, but it is a presentation about process. So I will be focusing a lot about process and particularly about planning within the context of that process. So you'll hear me quite repetitively, my team tells me, say certain things, and I do have a tendency to go on a bit about certain aspects of that process, so forgive me in advance about that. There is the usual caveat emptor, and that is that I'm not intending to provide advice here, especially when we deal with this whole real estate accommodation aspect of processes. You do need to seek advice from duly qualified professionals such as accountants, lawyers, and so on at the respective stages of the process, and then the declaration of interest, if you will, that I always make at the start of this type of presentation. There is an altruistic and an egotistical element to it. The altruistic element is that really we do wish to share information, as much of it as possible, that is relevant and useful to the audience that attends these sorts of things. And that kind of links to the egotistical part, in the sense that the more information we can share, the better qualified you as individuals can approach the market as a whole, not only us or me as an individual or the companies with which I'm involved, but the market in general. So the more informed you are as an audience, and the better you're able to deal with engaging with the market generally. And egotistically, if you choose to engage with us, we'd like our clients to be as prepared as possible. So we spend, those of you who know us already, there's a part of the audience that may well have engaged with us already. You will know that we ask a lot of questions. We try to engage you ahead of time, even though we are very overloaded with work as a business, but we do try to have the engagement ahead of time. And that means that at the back end, when people choose to work with us, they come better prepared. So we as a business, so the businesses with which I'm involved, have a certain profile, and we like people to work with us on a fairly exclusive basis, and well-informed clients. So whether or not you work with us, that doesn't matter. I think this is part of the process of businesses informing the market of what the market is all about and providing information. And on the back of that, we hope that they'll be able to engage more efficiently with the market as a whole. So after that introduction, the session today is going to focus on the second part of the process of rent before buying. To put in context what we covered already, for those of you who missed that, again, the YouTube will put that up, and we may run it again. The second part, which is today's part, is, and this is for an audience, so if you're in these categories, doesn't mean that you have to log off if you're not, but you're likely to extract maximum or better value if you are in one of these groups. So if you have a rental contract with a defined date, in other words, a fixed term contract which is likely to come to an end, and therefore you're looking at starting the search or accelerating the search for a real estate solution, something to buy. If you have found the area and location in which you want to live and you're now ready to move. So that was in effect part of the rationale behind using a rental. It is to make sure that you have picked your ideal spot in the country, and so that you're confident that you haven't made a mistake as to where it is that you want to live permanently. If you're having difficulty finding long-term rentals, or you're worried about the landlords changing their minds or selling, so this does happen even within one of the portfolios that we run, which is hundreds of properties. Every year we have probably half a dozen or so owners, landlords who sell their properties, and therefore, of course, those people who are tenants there very rarely get to stay, because most of those sales tend to be to people who are moving in with the intention of residing full time. So be aware of the fact that circumstances can change, and that is the nature of a rental. It is not intended to be a permanent solution by its very nature. The purchase is permanent, the rental typically is not. The other rationale and reasoning behind many people who are at this phase of the process is those of you who want to protect against rising prices. And I don't want to get into here, I cover this in other presentations about whether the market will go up or go down and whatever, and even though we don't have a crystal ball, the truth of the matter is that, and I'll talk about this in the next slide, the market has been going up, and there is no prediction of any crash in the market, notwithstanding COVID. So that's an important factor. I'll talk about it, as I say, in the next slide. Exchange rate movement. So you can see that this is why the Forex market is the biggest single commodity traded in the world. Hundreds of billions per day are traded. And the reason there is this volume is because it trades on volatility. There is a constant change between interest rates, whether it be the dollar and the euro, the pound and the Canadian dollar, Australian dollar and the South African rand, whatever it may be. These things are always moving all the time. And if you want to shelter yourself, especially if you're, for example, coming up to retirement and you do not want to be exposed to these sorts of volatilities or changes in the market, you may be considering the purchase. And in particular, if you don't, from a cost of living perspective, if you want to take out immediately one of the biggest costs of a monthly budget, which would be a rental cost, if you buy a home cash, and this particularly applies to many people coming from markets where the real estate market is buoyant. The US is a very good example at the moment. Pretty much anyone coming from the US is able to sell their house back in the US very, very quickly, at often above the asking price. And so you're cash rich in that sense. If you can make a cash purchase and not have any debt or financing on that property, that means you've eliminated a whole range of issues around the cost of living, of which the biggest cost is probably the accommodation element. And then the other thing is, if you are using a mortgage, you may want to benefit from continued low interest rates. And of course, the fact that the pandemic continues, we now have a new wave, Omicron variant, means that central banks, regional banks will be quite cautious in terms of their interest rate policy, meaning that they will, it's unlikely they'll be increasing that. So if you're in any of those categories, this is probably useful for you. We're going to cover double checking the decision to buy after renting. So briefly, the evolution of the Portuguese real estate market in recent years, very briefly. Rent versus buy, again, legal and admin required in rental versus purchase, and costs. We're going to talk a lot about the selection of areas. I want to dedicate more time to that than I did in last week's presentation. And then the approach, in particular for North Americans, sorry to keep singling you out, but North American buyers, and the existence of an MLS, a multiple listing service, which is something that doesn't exist in Portugal and many European, in fact most European markets. So that creates challenges. I'll their own, and we try to help buyers navigate that process. We'll talk about the cost of purchase and avoiding obvious and hidden problems. There are a whole range of useful services, and I'm happy to talk about those in the Q&A, such as mortgage services, forex, and whatever, and just briefly talk through those. But I don't want to become a long picking list of those. We work with a lot of partner suppliers who do all this, so we're happy to make introductions as need be. A very busy sort of red-yellow slide, but I'm just going to focus briefly on the top bit, and the message is there is no crash foreseen, and prices are rising, not falling. It is a seller's market. Okay. In brief, that's the succinct summary of the Portuguese market at the moment. People are surprised that this has happened. I am surprised that this has happened because Portugal in the past has been very, very fickle, I suppose is the right word to use, or perhaps not completely correct word, but when another major economy catches a cold and sneezes, then Portugal tends to catch a cold. With due respect to the whole COVID pandemic. But this is often what happens in economic terms, and we're finding that Portugal in the past has been very, very prone to volatility from other markets, larger markets, and the impact on the Portuguese market has meant very lengthy periods of time in terms of recovery and very quick at times in terms of crashes, into periods in terms of crashes. We lived from years post 2008 to 2009 with a dramatically difficult real estate market, probably until the back end of 2014. But interestingly, we've now lived in the Portuguese market with the longest single period of sustained growth into real estate terms that I can recall ever. On record, and I think statistically it is the longest since the back end of 2014, continually increasing market up in 2021. And even though the transaction volume has fallen during COVID, the average values per square meter, for example, have gone up, meaning that two things: the top end of the market in terms of luxury has not fallen. If anything, it's grown. And although the less transactions have taken place, the average size and value of each transaction is higher. Okay, so people, I would say the average budget of the person coming to Portugal has gone up. I can't remember exactly about how much, but it has gone up. In terms of property prices, globally across the country, so nationally, I should say, not globally, nationally, the prices have increased by around 8% year on year. And the other thing that I would point out is that there is a premium on new build real estate, which is anything up to 30%-ish versus resale inventory. And so the question is very much, and we're seeing this in regions like the Silver Coast, which for a few years already has had a dramatic difference, sometimes even 5 times. I know it sounds exaggerated, but in some instances 5 times as much in terms of pricing between existing sort of traditional build and new build. The market has started to price in this differentiation because new build comes with a whole series of other characteristics, in particular acoustic and heating, cooling, so thermal, that older properties do not have. So there is a premium that is starting to be built into that sort of new build and associated with energy classification and things like that. The very busy chart at the bottom, which I sort of stole off another presentation that I had done, slightly outdated now, but the general trend is the same, and that is prices are growing in the popular areas, primarily along the coast, and prices have fallen on average inland in terms of price per square meter for sales. So even though, and I'll talk briefly about the golden visa in terms of that on the slide, but that has been the general trend. And unfortunately, that is a trend that has socioeconomically continued to exist in Portugal, and that is an evacuation almost, or a migration of people from inland to the coastal areas, which is where most of the development has taken place. That's where the jobs occur. That's where there's more demand for real estate and for accommodation, and as a result of that, we have seen a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where most of the investment is also going into the coastal regions, meaning that prices are also going up more in those coastal regions. So it is a phenomenon which is not unique to Portugal. It's known in and exhibited in many countries around the world. Brazil is an excellent example of this. How much there is coastal development, and that's sort of a massive country, and therefore but it's something with which we have to live, and which you as potential buyers have to understand. Routes to residency in Portugal. So EU nationals, best of all worlds, freedom of movement. For those who don't have the nationality, EU nationality, but can get one, or have a family member that has one, then there is a process in Portugal called reagrupamento familiar, which facilitates bringing together of people in the same family, of course. Third country nationals, we talked about the D7 and the golden visa, because this second part is about buying. I've brought up again the map on the side. I don't think there's anyone on this presentation that's necessarily focused on the golden visa, but I always make the point anyway. The golden visa is going to change, the regime is going to change at the end of the year, and all the grey areas on this map that you see on the right are the areas that will be excluded from the 1st of January 2022. For all practical purposes, that ship has sailed. It's no use if you're starting looking at a golden visa in a high density area for you to start the process now. You won't make it in time. So for all intents and purposes, high density areas for residential real estate are no longer available to qualify for the golden visa process. I bring up this chart because there are groups of people, there is a subset of people that listen to these webinars who want inland properties. Maybe they want a quinta, a more rural property and so on. And it may be that if your characteristics and your criteria are those, that you may actually be able to use a property purchase still for the purchase of a golden, for the qualification and the application for a golden visa. Okay, and those thresholds are 280,000 and 400,000 for inland properties. We're talking primarily to a residential audience, so for all intents and purposes, we're not talking commercial or touristic property in high density areas, and therefore I'm not going to focus on that because I don't think it's the audience that's listening today. And then the non-habitual residency is a tax program and not a residency program, please, for those who sometimes get this confused. Right, rent versus buy. The last presentation catered for the rent and the reason why some of you are renting before buying, but I felt it was useful to go through this slide again, because some of you may still be deciding or validating whether or not you do wish to migrate from a rental to a purchase, and sometimes seeing this in a sort of a tabular format in front of us helps the thinking. So clearly, you're probably, if you're in presentation 2, you're probably not in the first category, which is not sure whether Portugal is right and you want to trial the lifestyle, but you probably were. You probably were someone who was renting in order to buy in the future, and now you're at the point where you want to buy. So that's clearly, if you are in that category, you would have taken the decision to rent or to rent before buying. If it's your final move or you love the destination, and you may now have reached that conclusion after an initial rental, then clearly it's the time to buy in most instances. And I would say, as an aside, even though most of you listening to this presentation are not Portuguese nationals, you will be joining a nation that is among, I'm not going to say the number one because I can't remember the statistics anymore, but it's certainly within the top 3 in terms of home ownership in Europe. The Portuguese aspire to purchase their own home. I think statistically more than 70-something%, or certainly very high 60s. It may even be as high as sort of 80, I can't remember, but a very high percentage of people have their own home, primary residence, which is clearly sociologically and socioeconomically important for the country because it gives a sense of security. So although salaries may be low, at least there is a sense that people have a stability and a permanence within their own homes. And so you would be, by purchasing your own home, really fitting right into the profile of the Portuguese resident, which is very much of a homeowner. If you want to build a revenue generating portfolio, now this may sound strange, but we have some people, not many, but we have some people that choose to move to Portugal, and because they like the country and they can see how people aspire to move to the country, they start buying second and third properties. We have at least half a dozen people, clients that I can think of, that have done this. They've bought their primary residence and then they said, well, I wouldn't mind having a second apartment. I'll buy a second villa. I'll rent that out. We'll, get somebody to help us manage it, or we'll manage it ourselves. So there is this tendency for people, knowing it's their adopted home now, and they become more and more expert and knowledgeable of it. They feel comfortable. They can sell its benefits to friends, to visitors, and so they buy a second property. So that's something that often happens. And if you're in that situation, then clearly you are a purchaser. If you have a part year residence, I've put here rent, but if you looked at the next point, part year residence with revenue generation, then clearly you are in the buy section. So that's where you may be. You may have taken a rental for, let's say, 3 or 4 or 5, 6 months, a winter rental. You love the country and say, well, I actually want to spend in my 6 months here, but you've had difficulties in finding the ideal 6-month rental, or you feel that you now know exactly where it is that you would like to spend those 6 months, and you're ready to buy, and then someone can manage the rental of that property. That's particularly interesting, for example, if you intend to buy and visit during the winter, because the summer, despite the COVID chaos that is caused by each new variant, but the summer continues to be this peak season. So the likelihood you'll be able to generate a lot of income, relatively speaking, in the summer months to fund both the property and even your stay in the winter is high. So that's a great solution if you intend to visit during the winter. So from northern climes like Scandinavian markets, Canada, and the colder climes where the winter is relatively mild further south. For those of you sort of coming from Florida or from Arizona where it's very hot, I mean, that may not be the best solution, because we find a lot of those people actually saying they'd like to spend a milder summer in Portugal, where, for example, they don't have the humidity of Florida, or the sort of desert-like conditions of some of the the Nevadas and the Arizonas and so on. So depending on where you are, this rent, this buy with a view to rent could be a good solution. And then if you, as happens again, if you were someone that rented because you were still waiting to sell a property in your home country, then you probably now have sold that property and are ready to buy. You're clearly a rent before buy candidate, ready to now move to the purchase phase. If you want flexibility and reduced capital investment, then clearly you would be renting. Then there are some considerations around residence status and the tax status. So for a tax status and a residence status, you need to be ordinarily resident in Portugal. Typically, that would imply 183 days a year, roughly 6 months. For many people, they think, well, if you're spending 6 months, I may as well own my own home. Although, of course, with low interest rates, especially with low interest rates, where people say, well, the cost of money is very, very cheap, and therefore it makes sense to do this, and this is so-called good debt, as opposed to sort of the credit card type debt, which is sometimes run amok in the modern world. The other thing which we often point out, which is for people that are considering retirement, and a lot of us, I say this often, a lot of us don't want to consider or think about what we will do in old age, and where we'll be perhaps more debilitated and so on. But it is something that we should all consider. We're all aging, we're all getting aches and pains, and at some point we will have limitations. What we're trying to do is delay those limitations as much as possible. But do think about the aspect of how you would like to live in the future as you age. We're not talking only about care. Of course, there will be a time where perhaps all of us will need care, and then whether residential solutions are right or care home solutions are better, that is a conversation in itself. But think of the period to getting there, and in particular, independent living solutions for those of you who are retirees and are of an age where you maybe want to be in a community, especially if you have a bit of horizon, then think about retirement solutions that are independent, but that provide all the sort of amenities that you would like. You know, the community, the accessibility, the modern facilities which you would expect, those sorts of things. And more we're seeing people not simply rushing into Portugal at the retirement age and saying, I'll just buy anything. They're thinking ahead and thinking, okay, what sort of product, what sort of property do I need to consider if I intend to age in that country. And this is obviously not something you would do only from a real estate perspective. You would also have to link this up to healthcare and how you believe you would be best suited in terms of receiving that healthcare, domiciliary care in an advanced stage, or or whatever. So I think work with somebody who understands these things, because this kind of strategic thinking about your future will have an impact on the type of real estate purchase that you make. And I always use the case or the example of the 45-year-old couple, or maybe even 55-year-old couple, who buy an idyllic villa in a grand villa in an idyllic location, far away from anywhere else, because they don't want to hear, don't want to see their neighbors. They don't want to hear a dog barking, only the crowing of the chickens or the whatever in the morning. And then they find that they can no longer drive, or they have a small accident and they can't walk as freely as they could, and suddenly they find that they need to drive everywhere to get a loaf of bread or a bottle of milk, and their idyllic setting becomes a bit of a almost hell on earth, because they can't reach anyone else, communicate, forge friendships, maintain those friendships. Their friends also don't drive that distance. So be aware. Self-awareness is absolutely crucial, especially when we're moving countries, as to what sort of decisions we take in terms of the real estate we buy. Purchase costs, very quickly. Closing costs of the purchase, 5 to 8% of the purchase price, depending on where you are. The transfer tax is a sliding scale from 0 to 8. The land, if you buy it, is fixed at 6%. Properties above 1 million, 7.5. There is a stamp duty called imposto selo, which is 0.8. Legal, so lawyers will charge you typically 1% plus VAT. Incidentals are small. The notary is different to the notaire, for example, or to the escrow agent in France, or the escrow agent in the US. The lawyer will take on the big chunk of the process, the due diligence, and so on, whereas other entities or people will do that in other markets. And then after the purchase, you have annual costs, including the municipal tax. This is for the local council to take away your rubbish, make sure that there's street lighting, clean up the streets, tar the streets, this sort of thing. You may have condo fees, or HOA fees, as you call them in certain markets, and of course there'll be mortgage costs where applicable. Rentals imply lower capital investment, of course, and lower legal costs. So you're not having a lawyer, paying a lawyer 1% or whatever it is plus VAT on the purchase, maybe using a lawyer to review a contract, something like that. But they also imply exposure to fluctuating prices and exchange rates, something which we've covered. Thus, the reason why some people go for a purchase. So the planning process, again, revisiting what we did last week, but I won't repeat everything. I've changed the slide slightly. I can't emphasize the role of the discovery tour enough. Now, this is an interesting one, because in the first presentation, we talked about the discovery tour as a discovery of the country or of the regions and the options within them, within each region. Here we are talking about the discovery tour in terms of narrowing or funneling down the options for someone, yourselves, that are already resident in a rental in the country. So one assumes as a starting point that you have now figured out that the region is fine. You, of course, are in a rental, so you can only deep dive in that area where you are physically living, but you may have already started to take out the exploratory trips and tours to other regions. Or when I say regions, I mean areas within the region. But there is still scope for a focused discovery tour, which will have much more of a real estate element to it. And I'll explain this in the context of the Finder approach a little bit later. So there is still scope and a role for a discovery tour, even at this stage when you are already resident in the country under a rental agreement as a renter. Okay, it's important because you may think that you've got to know the area, and that is true. You will have almost certainly got to know the area, but you still would benefit from an independence, especially if you are not 100% convinced or decided on the area in which you believe you would like to remain, despite your rental. So the planning should always include a definition of key criteria, and I'll be spending a lot of time, relatively speaking, on the next slide on that. And then touring the country, or in this case the region, I should have changed that to region, is not a discovery tour. If you go and drive out and have a look around, that's great. That's a sort of self-discovery. But if you're looking to work with someone and doing a discovery tour, then you should not be focused on things such as take me to the nearest beach, other than to prove the distance to the beach from the real estate, if you're someone who wants to walk to the beach or cycle to the beach. So please try to distinguish in the context of a discovery tour what a discovery tour is versus sort of real estate tourism, and I'll pick up on that a little bit later. The difference between the approach in terms of rentals and sales is quite simple. In rentals, your approach should be to go from the general to the specific as regards your search methodology. So we talked about using sites such as Idealista, Sapo, Virtual, and so on, and then go on to regional sites for the rentals. In the sales, it's about the approach itself. So it's almost a level up from that. It's not about which sites you use, but it's about the approach. You have to decide whether you are going to conduct that search yourself by using a combination of portals like, again, Idealista and Virtual and whatever, and combining that with managing multiple real estate agent relationships. Okay, and this is where I will make the first point about the non-MLS system. The markets like Portugal do not have a centralized repository of all available real estate. There are several that claim to be similar, and Idealista, the name that keeps coming up, I'm giving them free publicity on this. For goodness sake, I should send them an invoice. But they are one of the sites, an example of a site where you can go and find and look for property that is available. There are several downsides to these sites. I would say about 50% of the inventory is either fake, in other words, doesn't exist. It's already been sold and it's just there to sort of draw people in. It's outdated. And what I mean by fake as well, in the first category, there are really some fake listings. Sites like these large ones try to sort of narrow this down, but there are also some spammers and so on that have got onto these, or are represented by owners or agents that do not get back to you. So although they are a good starting point, the degree of reliability of the data is not high, and so you don't know, as a user of that system, just how well you are interacting with a real. I don't want to question the people behind that these are real people, but whether the product is actually real and ready to be sold. There's also often information that's not declared, and we'll talk about that in some slides as well. And you can't gather that from these sites. So if you are doing this by yourself, that validation process, that vetting process, which is multi-tiered, it's hierarchical, firstly through a portal, then drilling down to the agent, then vetting the listing itself, perhaps even needing to do a visit in order to validate that listing is as communicated. That is a multi-stage, multi-step process, which is very time consuming. And although let's say other people in the market, experienced people, may not have the magic wand to magic away all these problems, they will have experience in trying to vet and filter out some of the obvious issues. Questions and approaches that you may not have at your disposal due to the lack of market knowledge. So when you take on this self-managed process, you take on not only the time associated with that, but also the risk associated with vetting the detail. Now, clearly, at the end of the process is the lawyer, and the lawyer will do the due diligence, but there's a whole range of vetting steps there are a whole range of vetting steps until that step, and those are time consuming and complex. And so that's what you take on if you decide to adopt the first approach. The second is to use a property finder, and I'll talk a bit about that specifically in that context. I'm not going to go through this graph except to say that there are a lot of people in this green bunch at the middle. These are all the lines where people have indicated in the survey that they need some sort of assistance with some accommodation or real estate related expertise, whether it be property finders, selling agents, or whatever. There is a big chunk of you that require help in this area for obvious reasons. We all need somewhere to live. So we'll be focusing on that. Now, I'd like to spend a few minutes on this. And this is an absolutely fundamental first step. You know, you'll see posts that I do, but our team does, and so on. We often talk about these sort of, they're not magical, but they're important sort of 18 questions. I've only put 16 and a bit up here. But any of you who want us to do this exercise, run this exercise for you, please just email us. I'll leave the contacts at the end. Email us and ask us for this sort of, I call it the 18-point questionnaire. And then once you've answered those questions, we'll provide you with some feedback and some guidance. Sometimes it may actually point to working with us will be a good solution, and sometimes we're not, but we'll point you in the right direction anyway, no problem whatsoever. And that response can come in a tabular format, or it may come as a series of comments, depending on the situation. I'd like to go through the questions and make some points about some of these, and then go through the table. So the purpose of your move is absolutely fundamental, and remember that we're asking these questions typically at the start, prior to part one of the webinar, but we also do them when we ask people about their criteria to buy. And it's very important because we can make some conclusions and eliminate some things right off the bat based on these answers. So the first thing we'll ask is the purpose of your move. So things such as saying to us that you're moving as a family is immediately different to someone who is a retiree, for example. That will immediately point us, even unconsciously or subconsciously, to certain types of areas and zones, and even certain product types. So that, in terms of what's acceptable and based on our experience of different demographics, what's acceptable is an important question to answer. And we will often tell you, so don't be shy if you're engaging with us, especially with me. I will often tell you directly where I don't think that you're thinking correctly about a certain approach. So you may say, well, we're a family and we'd like to be here. And we will point out, and we hope we don't take this the wrong way, we will point out, if that's the case, why we think that your thinking may need to be a little bit different to what your original thinking is. And often this is due to the lack of your knowledge, and understandably so, of the local market. We just have these insights that hopefully are useful and helpful to people making the wrong decisions. Then the question of rental or purchase, or rent before purchasing, which we've covered in these presentations. The timing is also important, and the length of time that you intend to rent before buying. I can't tell you how critical that is. And unfortunately now there is a slight discrimination here, because as an EU citizen, you will have freedom of choice, if you will, and that's the plan, freedom of movement, freedom of choice, as to the length of time of your rental. If you are a visa applicant, you may not have, because the consulates are demanding, for example, many consulates are demanding a full year rental contract, even though the law states that you can, if your plan is to buy, have a contract which is a residential long-term contract that is less than a year. So there is this discrepancy between what consulates are asking for and what is in the law, but unfortunately we cannot get around that. The consulates are asking for that, and therefore your options may be slightly more limited. But timing is important, because when you look for a rental and when you look for a house can be influenced by the time of year. For example, if you're expecting to do, as someone wrote to us a few days ago, they're coming to visit between the 23rd and the 27th of December. Well, good luck, because this is a Catholic country where most people are celebrating Christmas, and who would be expected to be doing visits and showings, on Christmas Eve and on Christmas Day? I mean, it's totally unrealistic. So that's an extreme case. Now, clearly the people were just taking a holiday and squeezing it in. But that's the sort of message that comes across, is that, well, I mean, if you couldn't plan a little bit better than that, then you can't be that serious about looking for a property if you're coming at Christmas time. So I'll go through some of these criteria in the next slide, but the timing of this is absolutely crucial. The style of property, also very important, because it has an impact on things such as the heating that's available in those properties or not available, whether it's an apartment or villa, number of bedrooms, the distance to amenities, and whether it's walking, driving, that will impact also, or will have an impact, and depending on whether or not you have a car, which is one of the other questions. Then the condominium or apartment. And I mean, those people who are accustomed to using the term condo will understand that condos typically come with higher condominium fees because there is a managed garden set of amenities and so on. Some people do not want to pay these costs. So it's important to pick this out at the start. And we will immediately, as an example, point out that discrepancy, if there is one, and which is, oh, I want an indoor pool and I want manicured gardens and, and secure underground parking, but I don't want high condo fees. Well, impossible to get. A total contradiction, because those types of properties only exist within the context of a condominium, which typically comes with higher fees because it's managed and you have a reception and there are staff or, gardeners and pool cleaners and so on that are always there. These people have to be paid. So we will try to point out obvious discrepancies immediately. And I emphasize again, this can be done remotely if you're doing the rental or a purchase from a distance, or you're an investor, for example. I and other people and companies like ours do this all the time. This is not rocket science or magic. If you find someone who understands the local market, they will be able to do this efficiently. Things such as whether the amenities are shared or individual, and you may look at this as a risk reduction in terms of sharing cost if it's shared, or you may say, well, especially in COVID times, I don't want to share amenities. I want my own gym and my own pool because I don't want anyone else touching that. All this you need to declare because that will have an influence on the type of product that is proposed. Then the views, obvious question there. And then the budget. A lot of people are coy about their budgets. You should not be. I understand that sometimes on social media people talking about a budget might be counterproductive, but for someone who wants to help you and who is serious, a budget is fundamental. And in particular, this is important for the rental because if you're renting before buying, declaring at the start your rental and your purchase budget is crucial, so that the partner with whom, or the company or the owner or whoever with whom you are working, does not propose a rental that is in a place that is inconsistent with your ultimate purchase budget. It's no use, for example, that's the whole question in itself, which is sometimes people have very large rental budgets and very small purchase budgets, and you wonder, well, could one not translate that into a mortgage where you could get a much larger house? But putting that aside for a moment, it's no use having an experience in Quinta do Lago with no disrespect intended to either location. In Quinta do Lago, which is priced perhaps at 3,000 euros a month, and then buying a cottage in Lolé, which is in the same municipality in the countryside in Lolé, which is worth 250,000, whereas the house that you were renting in Quinta do Lago would have been worth perhaps 750,000. So you can see where I'm getting at with this, I hope, and that is that we try to maintain consistency, and it's important for you to set your expectation levels correctly across the entire rental and purchase cycle. Otherwise, there will be a change of level and expectation, and in particular if you have a family and your children have become accustomed to a certain sort of lifestyle, and then you have to downsize the entire family because your purchase budget is not sufficient. It's better to sort of manage those expectations right from the start, or alternatively remain in a rental. That may be a reason to remain in a rental, that you just have enough rental budget to live a better lifestyle than if you bought a house. Perfectly feasible. And then other factors such as the distance to hospitals, whether you have any pets, although that doesn't affect the purchase as much, and any special interests, which mean easy access. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about this table, because in this table there's an example of someone for whom we did this. This is a couple of months ago, and this person had a set of criteria, which included ability to generate income in the summer and the winter without an annual contract. So in other words, they wanted to be able to independently do something in the summer and independent in the winter. They wanted a traditional property. They wanted in something with a historical medieval feel to it. And some poetic license in the interpretation of medieval. Walking distance to amenities, then they wanted a wine region, seafood and water views, and expat community in the winter. So what we did, and then they had a list based on desktop research they had done of the areas they thought they would like to visit. So what we did immediately was we said, okay, we're going to plug that in, and then plug into the manual thing. It's not an automatic program. You need human intervention in this. And we're going to analyze the different regions and options and see which are actually a fit. And very quickly we could see, based on their first criteria, for example, ability to generate income in the summer and the winter without an annual contract, so in other words, separately winter and summer, that two of the regions immediately fell away. And in fact, if we looked further down the table, we saw they also performed poorly in two other areas. So of the 5 regions that they had picked out, it was immediately evident that 2 of those would have been a total waste of time for them to visit. They could have gone and done tourism there and visited on a weekend, that's fine. But immediately we saved, and they saved themselves more than we saving them, but they saved themselves time and effort in spending time analyzing and or visiting these regions because they simply were not a fit to their criteria. And in the end, in this example, Porto was the standout sort of winner on paper, but possibly with the Algarve being a second choice. The Silver Coast as well, but the problem with the Silver Coast is it didn't perform very well in anything else. It was kind of medium to average to very good, whereas the Algarve performed excellently. So really, and strangely as it may seem, because neither the Silver Coast nor the Algarve have any medieval cities, Silvish, for example, has some elements of historical buildings, you know, the castle, the old church, and so on. But other than that, there are not that many sort of medieval style cities. The region was always going to be those regions were always going to be short on that criteria, and therefore the comparison for this person was going to be between other criteria and in between Porto and the Algarve region, for example. So hopefully that's sort of conveyed the message that the planning and the sharing of your criteria is absolutely fundamental, and the person on the other side, or the people or the company or whoever's helping you, should be able to do this analysis. Now clearly they can only do this analysis if they have a coverage of the country as a whole. And this is where I come to the big debate that rages at the moment more than I think any other, and that is the real estate agent versus the property finder. And I should say at the outset that the property finder is a relatively new concept in the Portuguese market, and many people are trying to reinvent themselves in this way, and I will cover this so that you try and understand this. There will be some of you who are fairly advanced in the process and have identified a real estate agent with whom you are working, because that real estate agent represents a product that you have found, that you've identified a physical property. But there will be others that will be early stage in the process, and this slide is probably one of the most important in terms of deciding how you wish to attack and address the process. So I'm going to try to explain the difference between the two. The first criteria is differentiating between who has the legal obligation to be licensed, have a physical office, responsibility for property documentation, including the information on the legal status. Things such as, oh, there's an illegal pool here, or the wall has been built outside as well. There is someone who, before listing and presenting you that property, has to take legal responsibility for all of that. And that is what we call the listing agent. Okay? It is also the agent, because they have to literally, by law, have the documentation of the property, including the energy certificates, the contract with the seller, all that stuff. They have to have this in hand before they can even advertise a property. Okay, so they are really linked to the property itself and the seller, and they're often called the real estate agent, generally speaking. and there are thousands of them in Portugal, each typically representing a geographic area, and many of them having a focus or on a certain product type. Some will do only expensive villas, others will only do rural properties. So there is an almost a matrix type structure in Portugal where everyone's regional, even the big agencies, the big names that you all know, the Remaxes, the Eras, the KWs, the Century 21s, and whatever, they are at their core individual licensees, some of whom have several sort of offices, but that come under a banner. So at their very core are local people who understand their local market. And it's really important to understand this, that that's how the market works. And there isn't an MLS system that brings this all together. Okay? And there isn't a portal or a site that does this for everything. It just does not exist. So you then have the point about working with own product only or first, avoiding sharing commission. Now, this is a particular issue in the current market, and you may ask, well, why is that relevant to me? Well, it's relevant to you because if you are seeking a property and you are working with individual agents who are short of property themselves and who have to make a living from this, they will not, want to share their commission with others, which means that this collaboration between agencies becomes difficult, and also they will not show you everything that you might want to have access to, because clearly they want to sell their product with maximum commission as much as possible. So because there has been a shortage of product in the market, this problem is more prevalent and bigger than you might imagine. Now, you may not understand this right at the outset, but what it translates to at the end of the day is you may not be getting the biggest view of the market available. And the situation today is much better, I should add, than it was 8 years ago, where there was suspicion was rife between agencies and no one wanted to collaborate. Clearly, when I say no one, I mean almost no one wanted to collaborate. Today, it's the opposite, I would say. Even the big agencies and whatever are choosing to collaborate, but immediately there's a shortage of product. What they do is they redefine their commission sharing agreements between agencies, and as a result of that, some other agencies choose not to work with them. So again, looking at it from your perspective as a buyer, if you are doing this individually and you are being represented and interacting with selling agents, you do not have a guarantee that those agents will go out and want and be motivated to show you as much product as possible. And by as much product, I don't mean doing these real estate tourist visits of 10, 20, 30 properties. I'm totally against that. What I mean is just accessing the market and not being constrained by showing you something because of a commission decision. Okay, it's an important factor and a huge driver in the market, especially because individual agents work often on a no salary basis. It's a real, in my view, real issue in the market. It leads to perhaps some lack of professionalism in many sectors. A high turnover rate, people moving across, no constancy. But most importantly, these people need to live like everyone else, and so they need to close the deals. And because there's often a commission sharing agreement, even internally in some of these companies, they have to share it with someone else within the company. So they can't afford to share and work with someone else because there's not enough money in it for everyone involved in the process. And that's important for you as a buyer to understand this, because it will translate into limited options for viewing, and you may not see as much of the market as you would by using a different approach. Now, if you want to search the entire market right from the start and almost always share in an approach that's very similar to the MLS, the property finder is the way to go. And I want to drop down there because the first thing that's often mentioned about Property Finder is, who's paying the commission? Let me quash a myth immediately. You, as the buyer, are always, it's your money that's being used to pay the commission. It doesn't matter if people saying, oh, it's the selling agent paying the commission. That is, in terms of process, may be correct, but it's always your money. There is no money available for any commission unless there is a buyer, a willing buyer, actually finalizing the transaction and paying money. So please do not be distracted by this question of who's paying the commission. It's always your money. Whether it cycles via selling agent or via warranty to a buying agent, it's always your money. Okay, so hopefully I've quashed that myth, because it's a debate I have with people all the time. They're playing semantics. Always the buyer money facilitates and makes the property transaction purchase possible. Okay. Then there's the next important point, which is the motivation to negotiate discounts or reductions in price. Well, if you're representing the seller and the seller is paying you as an agent, and moreover you've actually signed a contract stating that you will exercise your best endeavors to achieve that price, well, it would be not only incorrect but unethical to try anything else. Therefore, it is impossible for that same person or company or agency to say exactly the same message or transmit the same message to a buyer, because they cannot possibly be representing both equally when contractually their obligation is with the seller. And this is important not because people don't want to find you as a buyer a good solution, but because they are contractually and morally obligated to the seller. That's how the process is set up. So sometimes frustration creeps into this process because of this conflict, but it should not cause confusion in your minds as buyers. You should understand that if you are, and this is a logical thing, if a transaction is represented by a single person representing both sides, there is conflict. Inherently, there is conflict, and you as a buyer will be less represented than the seller is. This is just the way that it works. So again, the motivation of a selling agent to reduce the price is very low. You will often find, and it's difficult because the market at the moment is very hot in Portugal, therefore you will often find the first thing is, I've got other people willing, I've got another visit tomorrow, and you can't tell exactly how much of this is sales talk or not. Whereas, and so it depends on you and how much you're willing to call the bluff of a selling agent in this regard. Whereas the motivation of a true buying agent is to actually negotiate that price, because they will not earn any money if they don't do so. And I'll explain that in a second. So is the commission at risk? So for a selling agent, never. The commission is guaranteed the minute their selling contract is sold. And they will earn money regardless of what that house sells for. As long as it sells, they will earn money. On the buyer agent side, depending on how buying agents have positioned themselves, and I'll explain that in a second, there could be very low risk to very high risk. And now if you drop down to my slide on the final model, this is also very important. You will find selling agents that have finder departments. I won't mention specific ones here because that would be, I think, unfair. But selling agents with finder departments that have kind of repositioned themselves as finder agents, but they're within a selling organization. So the intuit is exactly the same. The big organization either pays their salaries or they provide their training or whatever. So their loyalty to that organization, they will attempt to position themselves as a finder agent, but within the context of a selling agent. So realistically, they are not a true finding agent, because they will always present their product first and sometimes exclusively. So be aware of the finder agent within a selling organization. That is usually not a true finder, and the reason is that there is no risk. For any property that they're selling, their commission is guaranteed, and they will try to push that because they'll be given instructions to do so. The second one is the fixed fee finder. So that's someone who says, well, I will work with anyone, and they will, but they will do it for a fixed fee. So again, and they will usually charge this fixed fee a percentage up front and a percentage at the back end, sometimes linked to success and sometimes not. But because the fee is fixed, and it is, in theory, sometimes quite competitive and compelling in relation to the budget that you have set, because as a percentage term, it actually may be less. Two things happen. The one is that all the commission of the transaction, typically the 5%, remains in the transaction. So you are actually paying more on the transactional value for this. You're paying the finder fee on top of the commission, which is payable to the agents representing the sale. And also, because the money has been defined as a fixed fee, there's very little motivation for that person to haggle very hard with the seller, because their fee is guaranteed. It's a fixed fee, it's guaranteed. Now, I'm not saying they won't haggle. They often will, but the motivation is not there to haggle as much because their fee has been guaranteed. And then you find the what I would call the true finder, where the fee is completely contingent on results, and also where there is a guarantee that your transaction cost will never exceed the asking price. In other words, by one or other method, that finder will get or claw back their fee. You will warrant their fee, but they will claw back their fee through a commission share, or a reduction in the asking price, the sales price, or a combination of both. So as a buyer, you never pay more transactionally, the transaction as a whole, and there isn't that extra intermediary fee which arises as a result of a sort of a fixed fee finder. Okay, so that's important to understand in terms of differentiating who's a real finder and who's not. And then the last 2 points are one about region, area, and town specific. You will often find that someone who positions themselves as a finder linked to a region is someone who is an expert in that region. If you do not know exactly, and by region I mean region or town, they may only have, let's say, a coverage of things in Porto, historical area, and not Gaia, south of the river. Okay, but if you do that, then you will find yourselves typically in the hands of someone who has limited geographic expertise. If you are looking across an entire region, and the Greater Lisbon area and the Algarve are the two best examples of this, where you have very different sort of towns and locations, you need to find someone who's independent of the region and able to apply a methodology regardless of location. And often a local agent who does not have that breadth and scope, and wants to apply a finder approach, doesn't have the relationships in place to actually cover multiple areas. So be aware of that. If you have a local, and if you know where your search is and you want to work with a finder in a limited location, a local finder is good. If the area is big, then a local finder tends to be very limited or restrictive. Okay, very important point. And then the exclusivity. The true finder will ask you outright to work with them exclusively, and you will have to weigh up the benefits of sacrificing your own multiple relationships, emailing people, and managing the various different real estate agencies, versus entrusting the one finder and working with them exclusively, because they've got to be given the chance to earn the money. And a true finder when exclusivity, what that means, it doesn't mean that you can't help them. You can still be doing things such as internet searches, chucking them over properties and saying, hey, what about this one? And they'll tell you, no, this one's not good for that reason, or this is a good one, I missed that. So it's a collaborative process, but working exclusively with one partner. That's really an important distinction. Now, quick, coming to the end of this presentation, a couple of hints and approaches. The negotiation approaches that you may, or some comments about the negotiation approach. Whatever approach you decide, and you will have seen that clearly I'm much more in favor of a property finder than of the traditional approach, and this has been a maturation process over the years, but certainly it's much more efficient from my experience. Try to insulate yourself from the seller and the selling process by using an intermediary. This is regardless of your process. I mean, you don't know the market, you're not an expert in the market, use someone local who is. And they will protect you from things, and even then there may be some things that they will not be able to shelter you from, but they will be able to separate and protect you to a large degree from some of the difficulties that you face in the local market in dealing with sellers. I think I've talked enough about the selling agent representing the interests of the seller, as they're contractually bound to do, but I want to make a point. This doesn't mean that they will not be fair, It just means that they don't represent you. They will try their best within the context of what they are legally and contractually obliged to do. But they will generally, a lot of the people that I know, that we know in the market, are fair people. They're trying their hardest. They're trying to represent their clients. So it's not a question of them, purposely doing this. It is just a question of the context within which they work. It is a seller's market, so speed is important, especially where real competition exists, and I emphasize real competition, and timing. Working ahead of time really does work. Not too far ahead of time, but working ahead of time really does work. So use your rental period to validate the decision, and use it unashamedly so as a competitive advantage against those who cannot travel. If you are on the ground, use that as part of your negotiation to say, hey, I'm here. I've got my residence. I am local. I'm ready to move on a transaction, rather than waiting for so-and-so who promised you 5,000 more, but he's still got to get on a flight and he's going to be affected by the travel test, and he's got to change his mind. He or she going to change his mind. I'm here. I'm ready to go on a transaction. Don't be shy to use real negotiating points to actually convince people to work with you, whatever those negotiation points may be. Things to look out for: undeclared problems, especially when they appear in a visit. Those who've done a visit with myself or with a team will know how mad I get when I get someone, an agent, declaring something that they should have declared ahead of time. This is unacceptable as far as I'm concerned, especially where it involves a necessary legalization of something. This must be declared in advance and typically should be assumed by the seller. This is the only way to go, in my view. I'm very black and white in this. It's not always the case. There are deals that happen despite this, but my going in position and my suggestion to everyone is, if there is anything that is not fully legal, that should be declared up front, and the seller should accept responsibility for legalizing it. Okay? Obvious structural issues, mainly houses, and you would in major cracks, subsidence, very poor state, things like that. These things should be discussed. Independence of third-party professionals, especially lawyers. These should not be in-house experts. Okay, so and I'm not doubting that they could be experts, but there is again this question of conflict. So why use the lawyer of a seller or of a selling agency when what you're looking for is independence, especially in such a crucial thing as due diligence? Same thing sometimes even with mortgage brokers. Go for an independent mortgage broker. There are large firms that say, oh, we've got a great mortgage department. That's true, but it's not fully independent. We know how these things work. So we prize independence in this process, and we encourage it wherever possible and wherever reasonable. High pressure sale which is not consistent with the type of property or situation. There are often cases, and I've seen many more in Portugal than I've ever done before, where you need to act within hours, days, or a week. And that is true. You need to be able to have someone on your side and understand whether this is a real pressure or a fictitious pressure being created by an intermediary and by the seller. And then unbalanced, for example, promissory contract payments that are too high, unfair, furniture value too high, in other words, trying to artificially reduce the value of the sale, or illegal, undeclared amount in payment terms. These things should be looked out for and avoided. Clearly the last one, avoided. Those days are gone, thankfully, in the main, of sellers saying, oh, give me money under the table and I'm not going to fully declare the price. That's a no-go. That's a no-go area. So avoid that and walk away. And in fact, walk away from selling agents who are prepared to present product in that status, in that state, is what I would suggest. Think of the seller and the intermediaries. Now, the first 2 points were all about you, about us buyers. But now, in order to get a good transaction is where all parties are happy. Put yourself in the position of the other person, the seller. So avoid real estate tourism, the biggest bugbear of anyone in the market. That's sending lots of requests, requesting a large number of multiple visits, especially in different areas. I mean, you've seen a methodology, you've seen how you can narrow this down. Please think of the person, the intermediary, the agent on the other side, having to organize all this. having to do calls, make calls, cancellations, whatever, think of them in terms of the impression they will have of you if you act in this way. Don't make an offer and later introduce additional subject to criteria. For example, if you're going to get a mortgage, say so straight away. There are some sellers that don't want, or they want to prioritize people who are cash buyers. That's their prerogative. Declare your situation fully. Don't say that it's subject to a survey later on, once everything's been agreed. It can be the failing of the entire deal. Okay? Don't sell yourself as the perfect buyer. People don't know you. Money, the payment terms, and timing are what matters. In a very small number of cases, you might be able to form a sort of empathetic relationship with a seller who may be present in a viewing. But most listing agents discourage that anyway. So your ability to influence somebody by saying, hey, I'm from country so-and-so, and you're also from country so-and-so. I mean, this is a stab in the dark, and so it should be avoided. Stick to the facts and not selling yourself individually, because people don't know you. It's a transaction, business transaction. They'll move on in most instances, as will you. And we just want to focus on the objective. Haggling on the price, especially making offers without visiting. I mean, we won't even show or make a request for a viewing if we see that a client acts this way, which is, I'm just going to make 500,000 offers for everything in the market, depending, regardless. I mean, this obviously I'm exaggerating, but this is not an acceptable business practice and is not, well received as you would imagine. A Sunday is a Sunday everywhere. So regardless of time differences, the days are there to be respected. And to be fair, it's a combination of some people who are just perhaps not as motivated to get up on a weekend and do work, and others who genuinely need some time off. But do be aware that just because you've been busy in the week and now free on weekends, it doesn't mean that everyone else is now just free on weekends. They also work in the week. So I think respecting these boundaries is increasingly becoming important, because social media has intruded so much into everyone's lives, yours as buyers as much as the sellers. So I think there is a need increasingly for a show of respect, mutual respect, in terms of transacting parties in a transaction, and companies like ours would talk very openly about this in order to reduce the friction that may occur. And then if you are using finance, we try to encourage you to get pre-approval of something and an indicative value of what you can afford. And then finally, I said I'd spend less time today talking. I spent more, so that's quite typical, I'm afraid. A little bit about us. I won't focus so much on that. You can read up about us. I'm just going to leave the screen up for a few minutes, which is mainly the contacts if you wish to get in touch with us. As you can imagine, we deal with all these topics that I've talked about in this presentation. A particular emphasis on this property finding aspect of it. I wouldn't be talking so strongly about it if I didn't believe in it, but equally that is how we act as a property finder. We work with, I would say, 99% of our purchase clients are now exclusive clients of ours as property finder clients, and we find we can deliver much more quality service as a business in that area, dealing this way. Businesses like ours, and we're not the only ones. I think we're the only ones who work exactly in this way, but we're not the only ones. We work much more efficiently in terms of delivering the service and the quality of service if we identify loyal clients where we know we can add value and convey value to people, and bring these sort of tricks of the trade, if you will, to those clients. I hope that this has been useful for those who've managed to attend. Other than that, all that remains for me to say is I hope that you will remain safe. These are difficult times with new variants, and someone who caught COVID and suffered quite a lot last year from it. I'm well aware of the repercussions of this virus, so please do stay safe. Do what you feel is needed to be done in order to do so. From a business perspective, purely, and this is not intended as a business pitch, but there are many professionals in places like Portugal that are there to assist people who cannot travel and yet still want to progress their plans. And for those who celebrate this time of year, a Merry Christmas, and those who do not, happy holidays. And I'm sure we'll be in touch, and we hope to be in touch with at least some of you over the course of the next few weeks or month or so. Thank you very much, and stay safe. Bye bye now.